Today I'm going to be talking about research that I've done recently into collections in Kirkcudbright, which is where I'm principally based, of museum collections and the museum's collections that intersect with folklore. The approach that I use is I'm just kind of interested in those objects that kind of don't fall into any kind of neat category. I think folkloric objects or objects related to folklore kind of occupy kind of weird nexus between history and myth, and they kind of overlap. And folklore, I think, needs a bit of a definition because I think lots of people have different ideas of what it is, and all those things are valid. But historically, folklorists have talked about it as a kind of cultural expression that relates to manners, customs, observances, superstitions, ballads, proverbs of the olden time. And today, folklore still is concerned and interested in that stuff, but folklorists have expanded this to contemporary culture. So I'm always people are collecting folklore of COVID-19, for example. And one example that always sticks in my mind, not so recent now, but in 2001, when the Twin Towers were bombed in New York, I read an amazing paper by a folklorist who'd gone around loads of internet chat rooms and gathered people's testimony of the fact that they'd seen in the smoke swirling out the windows of the Twin Towers sort of demonic shapes and images and things like that. And so that kind of illustrates the point, really, that even the most modern phenomena, like, you know, the beginning of the war on terror, you know, people are interpreting it using older archetypes and older forms of tradition. And that's kind of what folklore is, shared beliefs and oral traditions as well that are handed down through generations. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in museum collections, and all of this stuff on this slide kind of relates to word of mouth literary cultures. But of course, folklore is also material. It manifests itself in the real world. People make stuff because they believe in certain things. One thing that I want to kind of, ask you to kind of focus on and think about as we go through this material is a definition of folklore that I really, really like. And that is that history dipped in myth is what folklore is. So folklore is history dipped in myth. That's a really lovely way of thinking about it. So the general area, as Helen mentioned just earlier, is this part of southwest Scotland. This is the Galloway Glens region. I'm going to be talking about folklore that's more or less within this area, with a particular emphasis on Kirkcudbright, because that's where a lot of material in the museum it relates to. Kirkcudbright is at the very bottom of that kind of tip of that estuary, near that little knobbly thing. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So I want to begin by talking about an amazing building. This is actually under the care of the John Priest and Galloway Museum Service 2, currently an art centre. On the top floor, it has a museum section, which talks about explores the history of the building. And the way I think about folklore is that folklore, no matter how kind of extraordinary or crazy the stories and ideas might be, they're always rooted in something real. They're always rooted in some sort of historical, social relationship, a place, a person, an agency that is telling a story based upon experience. And I was thinking of ways to try and articulate this idea, and I just kept thinking about the Tollbooth because it is, to my mind, a hugely important incubator of Galloway superstition folklore. Now, the next slide looks at what probably most people, if you're familiar with the region, think about when they think about the Tollbooth. They think about it in these kind of like beautiful, bucolic depictions by the likes of Charles Oppenheimer, as we have here. The next slide is kind of a more sort of colourful interpretation, which is a painting by Samuel Peploe. So it's these kinds of depictions of the Tollbooth and the kind of prosperous, merry town that is Kikubi now, and it is absolutely beautiful. If you've not been before, it's really fantastic. It really reminds me of St. Ives, actually. I suppose it's got that artist vibe as well. But the Tollbooth, of course, was a prison. It was a place of public shaming, a place where criminals were tortured and awaited execution. They were probably executed outside the building itself, where the Mercat Cross stood. That has been relocated. And so this was a place where criminals and nonconformists were reprimanded and held. These were people who had stepped outside the law, of course. And people like that are sort of textbook examples of what folklore can be. The folklore of the anti-hero, the criminal, the outsider. These are the main protagonists in sort of folktale and song. And of course, another hugely important group of people was magical operators or witches, also known as cunning folk. And about 35 or so witches were indicted in this region, and some of them were held in the Tollbooth, and some of them died here in the Tollbooth. And their imprisonment and their trial, and the dissemination of their doings, their magic, in the way that they created havoc, if you like, was disseminated via folklore, via newspapers, via printed ballads. And all this stuff had a profound formative shaping effect on the folklore of this area. But it all originated here. It originated in this building. So to give you a sense, some idea of the kind of people held here within this category of magical operators. These are some local colloquial names for magical operators in this region. So grass witches, that probably refers to sort of green witch, or somebody who is interested in working with plants and things like that. Another witch wife was another common phrase. Carlin or Carlines, a lovely southwest Scottish name for a witch. And more generally known as cunning folk, wise women, cunning men, cunning women, and so on. And they did basically a number of services. They were essentially people that you could go to, a bit like a shopkeeper, someone who you knew within your community, and you could go to them to find lost goods. They could tell you your fortune, they could help you with healing, either yourself or your cattle, and they could identify and punish witches, people who you thought were hurting you by a magical means. So from about the 16th to the 19th century, these magical operators were the focus of some quite strict reforms, and these were enacted by agents of local authority who were based at the Tollbooth. You know, the Tollbooth was principally the place where Burg, Kirk, Presbytery session officials gathered. They had meetings there, and it was also a place of imprisonment, of course, as we mentioned. And the Tollbooth was a place where these old ways, these old forms of superstition were investigated, punished, corrected. And it was a place where folk beliefs and what they thought to be erroneous religious views and practices could be made example of for their error, for their irrationality, for their sinfulness, for their depravity. This is what people thought. So, you know, the view we have now of the Tollbooth is a little bit gentrified because, you know, it's an arts venue. It's great. It's a great building. But they were once perceived as places where supernatural events and uncanny events were likely to happen. Now, I've got a really great example from Renfrew Tollbooth from May 1657. There was a woman called Janet Pullup who had been imprisoned there for 2 years, and she'd already confessed to witchcraft. And she was either asleep or at prayer, not entirely sure from the account, not that clear, when her guard, a man called James Patterson, believed that the Tollbooth was started to shake violently. So Janet was set upon by a number of cats, apparently, who were screeching and crying. This is according to James Patterson, before something like a large rat or a mouse tried to enter in at her mouth. And James Patterson, the guard, saw all these things and interpreted them as a sign that the devil was trying to stop Janet Pullup from praying or from being at peace. And he said to her, "Janet, you are not a witch, but some spirit has told you how to get possessions and money." So that just kind of illustrates one example of somebody working in a Tollbooth, working there, a reliable guard, a reliable person who had a job, who saw this place as a real sort of magnet for evil influences, a place of haunting, supernatural attack. And as a result, the kind of buildings themselves acquired this kind of revered and feared status. The lock here is an example of something being prized out of the door and kept as a kind of relic. And we've got lots of these things, handcuffs and so on. That's another really interesting object from the Tollbooth. So this is a shackle or a manacle belonging to the procurator fiscal, who was responsible for shackling Jean Maxwell, who was known as the Galloway sorceress. An example of jugs, which is essentially a kind of a neck brace, which people were put in and held outside. This one was at the side of the Tollbooth. That's an example of one in situ at the Tollbooth. So Jean Maxwell was a Galloway sorceress. She was well known. She was tried in 1805 and was imprisoned for a year. And one of her punishments during that time was to stand outside in the jugs at every quarter day and probably hold up a sign in front of her saying that she was in error, that she pretended to tell fortunes and so on and so forth. Okay, so sort of the weird, the weird stuff that happened in Tollbooth, the appearance of cats, the rat devil in Janet's mouth, etc., etc. All this points to, of course, a deep fear and belief in the familiar spirits of witches. And the tone was probably set by James I and VI Scotland, who wrote in his Demonology in 1597 about witches familiars in a lot of detail. And he said there that of them, they are transformed in the likeness of a little beast or fowl. They will come and pierce through whatsoever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatsoever open the air may enter in at, which basically means you're not safe. You're not safe in your house. You're not safe even in church. You're not safe from both spiritual and physical attack. And so this was really rooted in much older concerns regarding spirits, classical demons, airborne spirits that were thought to influence human beings and lead them either into wonderful angelic knowledge or into diabolical, sinful depravity. And it was thought that spirits could be summoned and addressed using magical formulae and incantations. In the case of cunning folk, these formulae were actually derived from grimoires, magical books. But also many folk cures relied upon sort of slightly garbled, older religious formula, often relating to sort of Catholic devotional culture. So this is the ruins of Don Drennen, which is kind of the very, very south of the region we're looking at. Beautiful, beautiful ruin. So in the 1650s, a woman called Janet Miller was kept here. Sorry, not kept here. She lived here. She lived in the ruins. And it's very likely that from the ruins and from the graveyards and so on, she scoured for magical charms, things buried underground that could be used in her magic. And Miller was a cunning woman. She was known to have used prayers and the sign of the cross to cure people of various supernatural, preternatural diseases. So one of the things that's recorded in the trial records is that she treated a man called what's his name? Where is it? Yeah, he treated a gentleman who collapsed in his barn in Bourg, and she said that the fairies had taken the power from him. That this gentleman had been attacked by fairies, and that there was very little hope for him. But she used a Trinitarian formula: in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, derived from Matthew's Gospel, used the sign of the cross to try and cure him. She was also in trouble because she identified witchcraft in her area about it. So this same woman, Janet Miller, who lived at Don Drennen, and she actually had clients from all over the place, Don Drennen to New Galloway. She claimed that a woman from Twineholme, a lady called Rosina Milligan, and another woman called Janet McGowan were responsible for bewitching a man called John Simpson. And Miller talked to Simpson and said, "You are being roasted as between three fires." And what she meant by that, he was being roasted by a fire of hell and roasted by these two witches who were trying to get at him for some unknown reason. This leads us to a kind of object, which is really, really interesting. In the witch trials that occurred in Scotland, one of the key aspects of them was that there was something called the demonic or satanic pact, the diabolical pact. And when someone was charged for witchcraft, there was two sections to it. There was a preface that included something relating to the diabolical pact, and the dictae, as it was called, or the indictment, began with this kind of stock phrase accusation that the person who was being charged for witchcraft had entered into a pact with the devil, that he or she had taken his mark as a kind of reversal of baptism and pledged service to him. So that was one part of the indictment, and the other part was the kind of folklore, the folk cures, charms, the different things that were probably part of traditional knowledge going back a long, long way. But they were separated out in the actual indictment. And the Satanic Pact was actually legal jargon. It was an imposition. It wasn't folklore at all. It was the result of years and years of theological and philosophical reflections by the elite of Europe. The Satanic Pact was essentially an elite conception and creation. And it's interesting to me that the folklore stuff, is actually rooted in place, and yet the one thing that did so much damage during the witch trials was essentially imported. Now, this is another example of the kind of interesting way in which elite and folk knowledge kind of intersect. Now, this is a toadstone. It was used for curing poisonings or bites. And when it was held above a poisoned area of the flesh, people said that it warmed up, it changed color, and sweateth, as it were, dropped. So it kind of, whenever it came into contact with something bad for you, it gave you a warning. This is an example of kind of old medical texts written by the likes of Pliny the Elder in the 1st century, Kyrianides in the 2nd century. These kind of elite magical medical ways of thinking permeated into society, and they kind of they were made part of the traditional knowledge of this part of southwest Scotland, and of course all over the place. And these stones were thought to have been extracted from the heads of frogs and toads, and it's a really good example of this idea that like cures like. This is such an important part of folklore all over the place. Similar bills curantor, that something from a frog or a toad, which was perceived as a venomous, poisonous animal, could therefore cure poisoning and bites and so on and so forth. So toadstones are actually, of course, as most people perhaps know, fossilized teeth from an extinct type of fish that was, I think, extinct in the Jurassic or Cretaceous period. I can't quite remember. And they're usually between 200 and 100 million years old. And aside from the way in which they were put to use for sympathetic magical healing, like curing light, these things began to sort of become part of folklore because they had to be gathered in such an extraordinary way. So there are lots of accounts of toadstones being collected and how you should do that, which is quite remarkable for saying that they're actually fossils. But some people said, such as a chap called Edward Topstall in 1658, that the toad should be collected and put upon a red cloth. Some people said it should be kept on this cloth for 40 days, and then the stone collected when the moon was waning. And others suggested watching the toad until it coughed up the stone and then grabbing it before it swallowed it back down. Another writer in the 1620s said that the best way to extract a stone from a toad was to place the toad in an earthenware pot and then bury it in an ant's nest. The ants would then pick clean the skeleton and leave the stone behind. Other giants, really, of the sympathetic magical healing world of the 15th and 16th centuries, a guy called Albertus Magnus, whose works became popular in that period, recommended swallowing unmounted toadstones to clean bowels of filth and excrement. So the idea there was that you would actually, let the stone pass through your system and then retrieve it from your stool. And then it was also used for lots of different things, but bites from rats, spiders, and insects, all cured by this stone. And by the 19th century, these stones were actually disassociated from medicinal use. People in the 1660s started to sort of question whether these things were actually useful cures for things or not. And as a result, the objects, so this is an elite object, this one you're seeing in front of you here. This is in the Stewardship Museum. This belonged to a man called John Cowan, a prosperous merchant, 16th century merchant, who founded a hospital in Stirling, a little few miles further north. And this stone actually was passed down in family until it actually came into possession of a Kikubri man, I'm presuming a long lost relative, who simply kept it as a lucky charm. So these objects sort of migrated between, through the classes really, from elite medical healing objects right down to people, poor people living in Kikubri. So the next slide, please, Helen, is an image of John Cowan, who owned this object. And it's really a fantastic thing. This is his effigy, which is actually in a niche in Stirling, a hospital that he founded. It's an image of a Bellarmine jar from Kikubri's stewardship collection. Now, on the theme of kind of elite medicine and folk magic, this is probably the best example. So this is a magical medicinal bottle that was used to identify and punish witches. And we really know this from two significant sources in the 1680s. A chap called Joseph Blagrave and another writer called Glanville, who both writing in the 1680s talked about why these bottles were used. And Glanville recounts a story of a Suffolk cunning man who helped cure a woman of bewitchment. And he told her to put urine in a bottle with salt and pins, heat it in the fire. The husband did this, but as he was doing it, a spirit worried him. A spirit seemed to attack him, and he dropped the bottle. The old man, the cunning man, then told him to do the same again, but this time bury it. And After he did this, the wife recovered, but the person who had been bewitching this chap's wife died because he was unable to go to the toilet, unable to pass water. So what's going on here, really? Basically, it was thought in the past that urine and blood were particularly effective magical conduits. And what's essentially happening here is that if you perceive that you were cursed, if you felt that you were cursed, the best way to turn the curse back on the person who had cursed you was to do something to your blood or your urine. So there's accounts of people plunging red hot horseshoes into pans of blood in order to make the person who had cursed them cause them pain. And this is the same principle. If you heat up or bury urine together with salt and pins, you're essentially creating a kind of micro environment where the witch will suffer pain. And that was the principle of this bottle. And this again comes from elite medicine, astrological physics, as it was known, the use of medicinal cures, the measurement of a person's urine together with magical ideas, and that principle of like curing like. So in Galloway, there seems to be a kind of scarcity of witch bottles in the archaeological record, but there are similar folk cures and spells employed by cunning folk and farmers in this region. So this is a beautiful belted Galloway cow. And unfortunately, these beautiful animals were really the most common targets of malefic magic in Galloway in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century. It was a source of income, of course, source of food and labor, even friendship for many farmers. And these animals were subject to many anxieties, many magical ordeals to protect them, many, it has to be said, indecencies as well to fight against witchcraft. And a key idea in rural folklore was the witch's attack on the cow, usually in the form of a familiar, so a cat, a hare, a weasel, a hedgehog. It was thought, of course, that witches could change into all of these things. And a witch of this area, a lady called Elspeth McEwen of Bogger, near the farm Cubbots in Balmaclellan, it was said that she used a magic wooden wand or a kipple pin that she kept inside her house that she withdrew from the rafters, and she would go out at night and milk cows. There's an amazing piece of folklore from the Ethnological Survey of this area from Lauriston, which says this: when a cow's milk was taken away by a witch, as much of the animal's milk as could be drawn from her was put into a pot with a quantity of pins. The pot was hung over the fire to boil, and the door of the house was bolted. The witch in due time came to the door and asked permission. The request was denied. If she was admitted, the milk would not be restored, but if she was kept out, the milk would return. So this example of folklore recorded in 1897 is basically a variation upon the witch bottle, the same principle. The thing that's been bewitched, a cow, the milk is taken from the cow, it's heated up with pins, and the point of it is to draw the witch, to draw the malefactor to the area so that person can then be identified. Once the person has been identified, you're on your way to stopping this person from doing it again. And a traditional means of stopping a witch was to scratch them, to draw blood. So, and lots of trials of witches relate to that. So we've got other uses of urine and salt, as we see in the kind of the elite use of witch bottles, urine, salt, and pins. In Galloway, urine and salt is used in less sophisticated ways, but also to protect things from witchcraft. Another piece of folklore from the area: before the cows were put forth to grass for the first time in spring, some had the custom of sprinkling them over with a mixture of salt and urine that has been long kept, and thus smelt strongly. I'm sure it did. There's another really good one, that says this. These are both from 1897, by the way. A buyer girl, basically a milkmaid, sprinkles her urine over a cow's back when she is going to calve. This is done to keep off witches and ill luck. Not long ago, a farmer's widow ordered her buyer girl to do this. There's also a really terrible story of a bewitched cow in Galloway, which was the farmer believed it had been bewitched, and he basically built a load of wood around it and set it on fire. And it's the same principle as the witch bottle, heating up the thing cursed. And unfortunately, this poor cow suffocated in the fumes and was basically roasted alive. But in the folklore, the person who bewitched that cow was drawn to the spot, and he felt terrible pain because this cow was being burned. So these are just examples of the way in which these kind of elite magical medicinal ideas have filtered down into folklore and have been changed according to region. These are actually Neolithic loom weights. So this is a piece of archaeology that are found all over the region. They're very common. And I was talking earlier about Janet Miller picking up material from Don Drennen Abbey. This leads to a sort of category of object which is really interesting, which is archaeological material which is repurposed and redeployed for magical purposes. So loom weights and stone walls like this were used throughout the region. At Cross Michael, which is kind of halfway down our region, hold stones were used, and they were called in that region bought stone. A little bit further west in Penningham parish, they were called Holt stone. And there was a really great story of a lady called Old Nanny Wilson, and she was in possession of a famous loom weight called Old Nanny's Mother's Trough Stain. And this was a charm handed down at the farm, and it was essentially a hold stone which was submerged in the water trough used by the cattle, and the purpose of that was to keep off witches. The next slide, please, Helen, is an image of a ruined byre, essentially a milking house and a place where cows could be kept. And these were really the focus of quite a lot of magic in this period and in this region. The next slide is an image of an iron stone. It's called a stone. It's called a witch stone. It was collected at a barn near Anworth Old Kirk. It was collected around 1900, but it could actually be a really, really old thing. It was something to keep off the ill sick or the evil eye. And although stones and hag stones, particularly hold stones that were used and draped on either red woolen thread or something similar, they were widely used as protective charms. This one's actually made of iron. And British folklore commonly asserts that fairies detest iron. They can't bear its touch or its presence. And so we could possibly see this less as a witch charm, but more as something that is about keeping the fairies away. Now, it's not really clear what fairies actually were in people's belief systems going back hundreds of years. There are a few different interpretations. Some people see fairies as demoted gods, demoted angels, who have ceased to have much power any longer on the earth as a result of Christianization. Others, like James I and VI, saw them as demonic entities who offered services to human beings that imperiled their souls. They were also seen as things that could take control of human beings and whisk them away. We'll talk about that in a bit. And some people see fairies as a kind of folk memory of a defeated race, a usurped people who have been told to move on from their territory by superior people. And that some people think that relates to the use of iron. So people invading with iron weapons were superior to people with stone tools and so on. and it's thought that the Scottish phrase cold iron, which has its counterpart in sort of like touch wood, might be some sort of evocation of this idea of Iron Age, Stone Age, people being superior to one another, etc. But there's lots of explanations. And the next slide directly relates to this. Oh, sorry, that's Amwithold Kirk, by the way, where this charm was found. So this is a really stunning object in the Shrewsbury collection. This is something that in tradition is called a fairy dart. And someone obviously loved this fairy dart very much because they set it in a rather beautiful silver mount. And some people call these elf shot, some people call them elf stones, elf bolts, or fairy darts. And essentially, these were okay, I'll tell you first about what happened with them. So we talked about cows a little bit. Elf shot was particularly prevalent in farming communities. So farmers would sometimes visit their cows in the field, and they would appear ill. They would be trembling or something, or they had rolled over and their horns had got stuck in the ground. And some farmers believed that that was a sign that their cattle had been elf shot. Okay, there was no external injuries, but on one occasion, one record in a great article called Elf Shot, which I've got a reference to, a farmer opens up the cow, and he believes that the cow had been elf shot because he found a hole in its heart. So this belief really is directly related to fairy lore, of course, but also to the notion that the land is occupied, that it's occupied by fairies, people that live there that can't be seen. And it's also directly linked to physical objects and archaeological material, i.e. these things here, these Neolithic flint arrowheads, which of course were used by hunters across this region sort of 6,000, 4,000 years ago. Now, flint arrowheads are found across the county, and some people have speculated that that this belief may have arisen from the fact that cows, when grazing, might have ingested flint arrows whilst eating grass, and that therefore they would cause these sort of internal injuries. It's also probable that if a cow was ill lying on the floor, a farmer may have made a search of the area, and he may have found these kind of curious little beautifully crafted arrowheads, and he may have associated them with the elves that way. So it's interesting how through sort of physical objects, beliefs begin. I think this is probably a good idea. Obviously, the objects are found and it enters into an already existing belief system. But it's interesting how things found in the environment can also become beliefs in themselves. So there's loads of really great folklore in relation to this. Again, in 1897, the Ethnographical Survey records from a person in Crossmichael again. If a cow began to tremble, it was believed that she had been struck with fairy shot. A wise woman was sent for, and she carefully groped over the animal's body for the hole made by the shot. A cure was a quantity of soot, salt, and butter made into 3 balls and put down the animal's throat. Another really great one, and one that's kind of pertinent to what we have here, is another piece of folklore which records a man's cow became ill and fell down. A skeely woman was sent for. That probably means a woman with skill. She came and rubbed the animal all over with an elf shot. The animal jumped up as if nothing had been the matter. So again, we have the principle of like curing like. The wise woman carries around a piece of elf shot, a piece of what is numinous material from the other world, and then that material cures the animal which has been touched by and shot by beings from the other world. Kind of makes sense. It's got a logic to it. So this brooch, really, this silver encased fairy dart. It may have been a decorative item. It may have been something just carried around by a member of the gentry, but it's likely that, like the toadstone, it was chosen to be worn in a particular way because it had amuletic properties. It could be worn as an element, as an amulet, and could be used. There's loads of uses for fairy dart. It's a really, really interesting aspect of folklore and agricultural folklore. They were often boiled in self-running water, and then the cow or the infected person was told to drink the water to cure them. So that's an interesting one. So basically, what this points to, I think, is these objects and these stories help us give us a sense that people in the past in this region believed that their environment, that the landscape that they inhabited, was not neutral. It was somehow inhabited, it was sensitive, occasionally benign, and occasionally aggressive. So another sort of fabulous example of this is an illustration from a great book called Witchcraft in Southwest Scotland. This is done by a guy called John Copland, who we have examples of his work in the Sturtry Museum's Liverpool Gallery. He's a local artist, and he was very interested in the folklore of the region. And his kind of collected works and illustrations of everyday life are really, really interesting. So we have, of course, something that you're probably all familiar with because it's been popularized a lot in films and things, is babies being snatched away by the fairies. And this is an illustration to show us that happening. So in the center of your picture there, you can see a wise woman called Lucky McRobert, who was from Kirkinna, and she was called in to help a couple who were having trouble with their young son, who was basically being a bit of an arse, it seems, as changeling fairy women, fairy children can be, although of course young children can be a bit annoying. So the parents really felt that their son was not their son, and so this is the folk charm that she used. She brought a load of rowan logs in, and the child started to understand what was going to happen to it and became very, very, very distressed and began to wiggle away. But Lucky McRobert tied this young boy to a riddle or a brander or a gridiron. You can see an example of this in the next picture that was just suspended over hot coals in cotters' homes. And if you go back to the other slide, please, just to give you a sense of what's happening here. And she lit a candle, the cunning woman lit a candle, and in that candle she pushed an adder stone. Now an adder stone is essentially a hold stone, but there's lots of different varieties of adder stones. Some people think a hold stone is an adder stone, other people disagree. Mainly it's thought that adder stones were created by adders, i.e. they all got in one place together and sort of created this or regurgitated this stone by sort of all biting round it at the center, and it was thought that a coil of adders would leave behind it an adder stone, and that stone could then be used to charm away witches and fairies. So it's quite a numinous object. It's probably a naturally occurring stone. It's probably something along the lines of a loom weight as well, although the descriptions of them or the adder stones are a little bit more glass-like. But essentially, she pushed an adder stone into the candle, and the rowan wood started smoking. She put the rowan wood on the fire, and as, of course, traditional lore tells us, rowan is a way of protecting oneself from the fairies, and smoked up the entire cottage. The boy shrieked and cursed before disappearing up the chimney. But it was a happy ending because the fairy changeling was gone, and they heard a knock at the door, and their real son was on the doorstep. So this is a very interesting story. But it's an interesting illustration of the kind of rituals using everyday objects that cunning people put to use. We've seen a changeling go up the chimney, and of course the chimney and thresholds in houses, as we've heard from James I and VI of Scotland, were places where evil influence would enter into your home. And in many parts of Britain, you'll see protection marks like these. So on the left-hand side, we have a daisy wheel or a hexafoil. On the right-hand side, you see various examples of what are thought to be apotropaic marks or evil-averting marks, circles, Marian marks. I don't know if you can make it out on that one, but it's kind of like a hand shape, but it's got an extra finger. Some people think that that's the Marian mark, a protection mark, because it refers to the extra finger on the witch's hand. I'm not sure about that one, but those particular marks are actually from Sir Isaac Newton's house, Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, which is interesting. Again, this overlap of elite men of science and folklore and ways to combat witchcraft during the early modern period, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. There's no real distinctions between the two. There are some distinctions, but there's more to connect them than to separate. So all these marks on your screen here are thought to be in some way protective, because they're found in liminal locations, so by the doorways, by the chimney place, and so on. They probably also draw upon semi-religious or arcane symbolism that was thought to have an effect against evil spirits. The next slide shows the way in which have I included it on your one? No, I haven't, have I? That's okay. It doesn't matter. It's all right. Just leave it on that one, please, Howard. Basically, I was going to show you a slide of it's a 6th to 9th century stone found in the landscape, which was carved by a daisy wheel. Sorry, if you could go back up to the slide with the daisy wheel on it. This was the stone was found in Glasserton in Wigtonshire, and the point of it really was to suggest that you don't really find that many of these marks in Galloway. Now, if you live in an old home, if you know of marks like this existing in buildings, church buildings, and so on, please do get in contact with me, because I'd love to know more. But my understanding is that Galloway doesn't have many of these motifs operating as protection against witchcraft or spiritual harm in this area. For some reason, we don't have it. Now, there may be a few reasons for that. And one of the reasons I'm going to put forward now is that we have in Galloway a really strong record of house protection rituals that don't mean inscribing into the wood or into the plaster or anything like that, creating a visible mark. You have different ways of protecting your house. So one example would be if you go into a new house, before crossing the threshold, it was thought wise to throw in an animal, a chicken or a cat, into the room, because the ill look of that home would fall upon the animal first rather than the occupant. Now, this is an interesting one, and it might be there might be a parallel in Russian folklore of leaving animals on the site where you wish to build a building. Apparently, in Russia, they do this quite a lot. You're building a house, you leave an animal on the site where you're going to build a house first, and if the animal survives a couple of nights, then it's possible that that site is okay, and the genius loci, the spirit of that place, is happy to let someone live there. But it's an interesting one. It's an interesting sort of parallel to the sort of fairy lore we were talking about earlier, that there are people, there's a race of people, powerful spirits that live and occupy the landscape, and you need to run it by them first if you're going to do anything. So this is what this Galloway folklore refers to. There's also, weirdly, quite a lot of folklore to do with cursing houses that you're leaving. Obviously, this must have been a big thing. I'm just going to include you, just going to read out one of these. So this is, again, from the Ethnographic Survey of 1897. A family of the name of Bernard went into the house at Hull House, from which had gone out another family that bore an ill wish against the new tenants for putting them from the house. The fire of stone and green thorn had been placed on the hearth. Now, the fire of stone basically means building up the fireplace with a load of stones as a curse, as a way of wishing ill luck on that building. And the introduction of a green thorn placed in the hearth is interesting too. And the folklore carries on. The usual precaution of casting in a living creature, as we heard earlier, had been omitted. And the first person into this building, the youngest son, entered the house, and he did no good afterwards, it was said. He fell into weak health. And the person said that my informant had heard the young man's brother tell the story in 1897. And this is of a place called Ringcroft, Stocking, in the parish of Rerick. And I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but it's one of the earliest accounts of a kind of poltergeist. And it's from this region. It's from 1695. And it basically is an account of a family who were tenant farmers who moved into this house in 1694, I think. And essentially the violent apparition is said to have plagued this home and thrown stones at the occupants and set buildings and beds on fire, attacked and dragged family members around the house and yard. And all of this stuff was recorded in explicit, highly detailed analysis by a local minister called Alexander Telfair. And there were other ministers from the Galloway Glens region, from Kells, Cross Michael, who were called in to witness these events as well. So lots of interesting folk magic stuff is recorded here. There was a package of small bones and flesh wrapped up in a paper and left by the door at one of the nights. And after these apparitions appearing night after night after night for 3 months, the spirit finally vacated. They left on the 1st of May. Now, a lesser known fact about this haunting, possibly, is that a few years before these poor people had moved in, a cunning person had instructed a former tenant to do this. She was called the Witch of Rootin Bridge, which is near Dumfries, and she was consulted by the previous owner of the property, and she instructed him to go to this croft, the Ringcroft stocking, and look under the threshold and destroy what he found there. So this chap did so. He went there, he looked under the threshold of the door, and he discovered a tooth. But it was a tooth unlike that of any animal. And what he did, he burned it, and it burned up, and it had a wax-like quality. And from that point on, he never had any trouble with the house. Concealed objects. This leads us on to a category of object which is really, really, really great, I think. So interesting. So this is a shoe. It's in the Shoe Museum. It was recovered from a building in Bourg, the manse actually in Bourg, by a guy called A.A. Walker. And it's thought that objects like this were deposited in buildings for a variety of reasons. We don't really know because there's no documented evidence, but we know that thousands of shoes have been found in archaeological context within the home. And there's a large database of this kept by Northampton Museum. There are several explanations. Shoes, through wear and tear, become adapted to the wearer's foot. Through excretions of sweat and so on, they become imbued, it's thought, with the essence of the individual. And as a result, during times of intense paranoia regarding witches and witchcraft, shoes may have been deposited in the fabric of buildings as spirit traps to encourage the evil spirit to attack the shoe rather than the living occupants of the house. Now, we found these shoes in all sorts of different locations, but they're often under floorboards, in roof spaces, sometimes in voids in the wall. sometimes in chimney breast areas. And another way of interpreting these things is seeing them as maybe as a form of offering to the spirits of the house. We've seen how you would throw a chicken into the house to offset any danger to yourself. Perhaps there was a similar sort of thinking about shoes deposits in buildings as well. Some people have talked about these shoes as called closing deposits, a kind of an archaeological term, which essentially means trying to materially and spiritually identify with the house, so leaving a part of yourself in the building itself. But I want to talk about just briefly, because I know we're getting on now, how folklore can maybe bring a new way of interpreting these sorts of these objects. Now, the next slide, if you wouldn't mind, Helen, is a selection of items from Stranraer Museum, actually. Stranraer Museum has got a massive collection of shoes, and this central image here is a sock. Now, sock deposits are quite unusual. This was found in a fire in a void in the wall above a chimney breast on the interior of a house, and it's slightly burnt. It's got kind of like sort of burnt effect on it, and it was stuffed full of thistles. Now, there's lots of ways to interpret this, and I can't go into all of them, but there is some suggestion that for a certain period when this was deposited, for the mid 18th century, thistles were being used in folk charm to treat cancer, believe it or not. So it's possibly some sort of medicinal charm. It may have been rubbed upon the infected area and then deposited in a place, a void within the building, was thought to sort of deposit it and give it to the other world. Not sure. Shoes near fireplaces have interesting connotations, again, for a medicinal cure, because if this is folklore from southwest England, I think, the left shoe of a person of the opposite sex of the patient is reduced to ashes and ingested. This was considered a cure for erysipelas, also known as skin complaint, also known as St. Anthony's fire. So that may explain why sometimes you find shoes which have been slightly charred or burnt. Maybe they were being slowly burnt and the ashes ingested over time. Hard to say. But I think there's other explanations. And this is still early days because I'm still researching this, but I'm hoping to sort of write it up into something, I hope, fairly interesting. And because the shoe deposits in Galloway, the region of Galloway is so interesting because it has lots of cultural connections with interesting parts of the world, which you don't necessarily get in other parts of the UK. So there's a lot of connections with Norway, as well as Gallic influences and Danish influences. And the kind of Hiberno-Norse occupation of this area was for a long, long time. So the folklore of that particular region is very important to this part of the world. And there's a scholar of the folklore of that part of the world called Anne O'Connor, who has identified a large belief complex surrounding the idea that in this area there are certain souls who are destined to wander endlessly in the afterlife. Now, this got me thinking about shoe deposits and so on. And there are various narratives which you find in the Isle of Man, in Dumfries and Galloway, lands belonging to the sort of Norse earldom of Orkney and so on, that fit into something called the intentional, unintentional baptizing of dead child spirits, folk tale typology. And what that essentially means is that there are stories related to unchristened children and what they get up to in the netherworld. And there's one particular story which relates a child running around a churchyard in something called short hoggers, which are essentially stockings with no feet. The feet have been worn away because the child has been endlessly wandering in this kind of liminal world between earth, heaven, and hell. So basically, and I'm not there yet, I'm still thinking about it, it's possible that that these shoes have some sort of direct relationship to the spiritual act of walking after death, if that makes sense. It's possible that shoes are somehow bound up with concerns for unbaptized people, providing shoes, socks for them so they may continue on their journey. I just want to read out to you a really wonderful passage from a manuscript in the Cotton Library, which relates to a piece of folklore collected in the North England borders area. And it relates to a belief regarding people and what they do after death. So it says, when any dieth, certain women sing a song to the dead body, reciting the journey that the party deceased must go. And they are of the belief, such is their fondness, that once in their lives it is good to give a pair of new shoes to a poor man, for as much as after this life they are to pass barefoot through the great land, full of thorns and furzens, except by the merits the arms aforesaid they have redeemed the forfeit. For at the edge of the land an old man shall meet them with the same shoes that were given by the party when they were living, and after he have shod them, dismiss them to go through thick and thin without scratch or scale. So that essentially relates to this really beautiful idea that it's good to give people a pair of new shoes because you'll need shoes in your afterlife. So maybe that relates to why shoes are being put in houses across Galloway and being deposited in floorboards and in chimneys. I don't know. It needs a lot more research, but it's really, really interesting. And as I say, there are hundreds of shoes being found almost daily across the UK in archaeological context. So it's a really interesting part of folklore. These are two images relating the story of the Brownie of Blednock. Blednock's in Wigtownshire, but essentially there's a connection to the area we're looking at because this is a brownie, so it's kind of the spirit which was thought to help people do tasks for them in Scottish folklore. They're very prevalent. They kind of enter into your house in the night and they do jobs for you. But if you give them the wrong kind of gift, then they will leave your house and never come back. So these are some really interesting examples. This Hornell image is fantastic. I absolutely love this image of the Brownie of Blednock. And we have loads of Hornell pictures in Kikubi Gallery, so it's well worth coming to see those. So the next slide shows the connection to this area. And it was thought that the Brownie of Blednock, his actual folk name was Akendron. And I've got a theory that maybe Akendron was maybe some sort of dead person who was wandering to try and, fulfill jobs so he could move on to the next phase of existence. I don't know. But one of the pieces of folklore associated with him, that he could not stand the sight of this communion chalice. Now, this was used in Balmainty in Kirk, used by a famous Cameronian Covenanter preacher called Macmillan. And it's a really fantastic object. And another interesting aspect of this cup was that it was, according to folklore, made from melted down metal from Don Drennen Abbey. So the abbey itself was dissolved in 1606. The plate was all melted down and made into these new cups, which this spirit from the other world couldn't bear seeing anymore. The majority of what we've been talking about today has been sort of stuff in the collections, but of course there's lots of folklore, and this talk can never hope to be a kind of exhaustive account of the kind of folklore that we have in Galloway, because there's just so much and so interesting. And I've just kind of looked at stuff that interests me and that is directly related to collections that we have or stories related to the collection. But of course that there are amazing giant stories in the region, giant caves and dikes believed to have been erected by people who lived in the region, giants who lived in the region. And again, another connection with this story, if you go down to the next slide, please, in the Street collection, the image here shows you, I almost kind of cried when I found this stuff in the archive, because this is a whole bunch of unpublished, untranscribed books relating to folklore of the area, written down in around 1810 by a man called Robert Malcolmson. Robert Malcolmson was a correspondent with Walter Scott. So we've got amazing resources in the collections in the Stewartry. And one of the reasons why I started the Folklore Museums Network is because it's in these local authority museums, in these small rural, often rural museums, where the best stuff relating to folklore can be found. Amazing source material. And I'm actually transcribing one of these books for the Edinburgh Ethnological project. So hopefully that will be published fairly soon. It'll be free to view. It'll be an online book. I found a reference in these documents to a tradition that giants had been dug up on St Mary's Isle, which is St Mary's Isle is that little promontory just below. So people in the 1810s said that they found huge bones belonging to the monks of the abbey there. So who knows? Maybe there was a race of giants living in Galloway. You never know. So the next couple of slides relate to a kind of subject that's very close to my heart, really, which is wells and springs and things. Now, this isn't a holy well. It doesn't relate to a holy well. It relates to a kind of a well, a source of water where a crime took place. Now, these are the arms of Clan MacLellan. They have a big castle in Kirkcudbright. If you go to the next slide, please, Helen. That's the castle in Kirkcudbright. Doesn't have all that ivor over it now, which is a shame. But if you go back to that picture again of the crest, you'll see there a sword with a head stuck on the end of it. Well, that head once belonged to a murderous outlaw called Black Murray, and he was, according to some traditions, he was a Moor, a Saracen, but other people said that he was just a gypsy. And what happened was that the head of Clan MacLellan wanted to prove his worth, and so he set himself the task of killing this outlaw Black Murray, who was harassing the neighborhood. And he spies him at his camp, and he fills the water well, the spring, which he drank from, with rum. And he then, the Black Murray then sort of drinks from the well and becomes completely intoxicated. And like the true hero that he is, he cuts off his head in his sleep and sticks it on a sword. And he goes to see James I, and this is where his motto comes from. We should go back to that, which is to think on. So MacLellan is so, so powerful that he encourages the king to think on and think about giving him more land and so on. And the well still exists. You can see it on the OS map there, on the Black Moray plantation, but initially that was called Black Murray plantation. And this kind of brings us full circle to the next object, the final object I'm going to be talking about, which is on the next slide, please, Helen. This is a horn cup and a spoon belonging to probably one of the most famous characters from Galloway history, which was Billy Marshall, king of the gypsies. Some people also called him the last king of the pit. And Billy had a fairly unusual reputation. He was quite a bloody character. I think one biographer politely said that it was shrewdly suspected that Billy Marshall had stained his character and his hands with human blood, which is to say he probably killed a lot of people. By the standards of the day, he was probably a serial killer. He had lots, but then again, these might have been folklore, put out there by his enemies. There's some really interesting folklore to do with Billy Marshall. He's like this folk hero. He commits a terrible crime of killing somebody for their jacket, but he's thought of as a folk hero in the end because he gives somebody who takes the rap for his crime, he then goes to prison and breaks them out and things like that. So he's one of these kind of like really interesting, unusual people And we have a collection of the things that he made. He was a gifted artisan. He had an unusual flair to craft horn cups and spoons. And this object was made by doing his own hands. And it also bears his signature, which rather unimpressively in X, you can just see that above 78. But that again relates to a main piece of folklore that he was, according to some gypsy traditions, the marshals had X's in the palm of their hands, which was a mark of shame put on them by Almighty God. The marshals didn't really like this interpretation of why they had X's in their hands, but he used it as a signature anyway. So really, that's kind of the end of the presentation, looking at these objects that kind of intersect with folklore. And it's my belief, and strong belief from working in several museums across the country, that every single museum collection has stuff like this relating to local folklore. So this is kind of why I set up the Museum Folklore Network. I really want to get these objects out there to start talking about local and regional identity. And I hope that this presentation is giving you a better understanding of the kind of folklore objects that exist in this part of the world. I would really encourage all of you to come to our museum. So thank you, Helen. So here we are. On the left there is Galloway Galleries, beautiful new build, and the Stewardship Museum. So thank you very much for listening. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take. And here's some links as well. So thanks a lot.
So question-wise for yourself, Peter, there was a talk at the start about grass witches, and I think Mark from the Folklore podcast was mentioning that grass witches was a local variant of hedge witches. And then there was talk about Ian was saying that hedge witches is the term in the South Pennines. And then there was also Mark was explaining that hedge witch is usually a term for a solitary witch, but also used to refer to what some term a kitchen witch, using natural and herbal remedies and so on. So how does that relate to grass witches? Is that a variant of hedge witch, or is that something else?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think it's a southwest Scotland variant of a hedge witch, somebody who uses principally sort of herbs to heal, or using concoctions of herbs in some preternatural way. So yeah, I don't really have anything more to add to that. I think that's right.
That's good. Oh, we got a nice, interesting one from Joseph. I think it was quoting yourself, folklore is always rooted in something real. He was asking, is reality always rooted in the realm folklore evokes? There you go, Peter.
I might have to ask you to repeat that. I'm not sure.
I know. It's a thinker, I think. So yes, folklore is always rooted in something real. Is reality always rooted in the realm folklore evokes? So that's trying to, yes, that makes history.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer it. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know one thing. This probably isn't an answer to the question, but I was reading something the other day about what folklore is, and I think it was Margaret Atwood said that she felt that all folklore was basically dreams or dreaming that had been kind of written down and then passed on until it became narratives which made sense again. Do you know what I mean? So we all have dreams that kind of don't make sense, and then they may make sense to us later on in life, or we may remember something, and then but then there's kind of stories that we tell ourselves, like folklore and folk tales. They're almost like these kind of archetypal stories that kind of get ironed out over hundreds and hundreds of years. So I don't know if that anywhere approaches any kind of answer. I think it's more it's something to ponder, isn't it, really?
No, I think yes, exactly, that you could thought for thought, I think. So we also had sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Jan, where witches, women who were branded negatively so men could take their land, often branding landed widows as witches. think that played a part? Is it people trying to get hold of their land?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that certainly happened. Yeah, I mean,
Was it a kind of trend?
Sorry, say that again.
Was there a kind of trend in who was being accused, if you know what I mean? Was there
yeah. So there's a really good Scottish survey of witches online, and I think this might be wrong, but I'm thinking it's somewhere in the region of like 73 to 75% of accused witches in Scotland were women. That might be wrong, but it's in that region. It's 2/3 or something, more than 2/3. Sorry. As to specific reasons, I think you have to take it case by case, because I don't think it's I think it's really hard to say and identify always a kind of a particular sort of patriarchal reason for persecution. I don't think that's always present. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Often I think witches were accused over quite small, petty, neighborly disputes. That seems to be, if we're going to say anything about witchcraft, that seems to be generally the thing. You had a dispute with your neighbor, you wanted to get one over on them, you couldn't do so, in terms of money, or, they had better things than you, or, so witchcraft kind of played a part in that. But even saying that, I think, is to overstate it. I think you really have to take things case by case. And I'm not an expert in witchcraft trials and the reasons for it, so I couldn't really answer that with any kind of authority, I'm afraid.
No, that was good. It was good to have your thoughts on that, Pierre. We had, yes, Colin, when you were talking about the witch marks or the protection marks, Colin was asking, which I may say wrong again, are these related to, is it sigils? I think they're SIGIL.
Yeah. Yeah, it's possible, I think. Yes. So sigils are a kind of a way of imprinting the powers of the planet onto something physical to make that thing take on the quality of the planet. So it's part of an astrological worldview, which is kind of a sort of astrological and semi-magical worldview, which was certainly prevalent in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries that we've been talking about. So yeah, the sigilization of buildings with protective marks, I think that's probably what's happening. And certainly the daisy wheel mark, I think they're protective marks. I don't think necessarily they're even protecting against witchcraft. They may be, but I think those kinds of symbols are potent symbols which people think will give protection to a building if that mark is on the building, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like the Romans putting phallic symbols on things to give them strength. Lots of phallic symbolism in like Roman forts and things like that. I think they thought the power of the phallus could be imprinted on the building by drawing phalluses on it. So yeah, it's kind of makes sense to talk about it that way. Yeah,
no, that's great. Michelle was asking, well, actually, I'll stay with the symbols. Yes, that was right, because before I move on to that, Kat was asking, what about this daisy symbol of protection against witches being incorporated into stained glass windows? Have you seen that? Is that a common occurrence?
What, the daisy wheel, sorry?
Yeah, the daisy wheel, so.
Stained glass windows. I don't know. I mean, yeah, probably. I don't know. I don't know of any examples. But yeah, maybe. They do appear in churches, absolutely. There's one theory that daisy wheels may have been consecration marks. So in sort of early medieval Christianity, a bishop would consecrate a church by making marks on it, and sometimes the kind of the physical mark left by stonemasons on the walls. Some people think that there's a correlation between bishops putting holy water on the wall, and it's broadly in a kind of a daisy wheel type shape. And some people think there's a connection between that ritual of putting holy water on the walls and a daisy wheel type shape on the wall. There's a bit of literature on that, but it's all kind of speculative, really. Not really sure. So yeah, but stained glass windows. No, I'm not sure about that. I'm not. I don't know. I'd be interested to see some examples. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, that is quite good actually. Oh yes, Michelle was asking, was rowan used in Galloway? Now, I think I've come across this as it being a kind of protection.
Yeah. There's a lot of folklore related to rowan and mountain ash. And on the links, I think I included it on it, which is the sort of the general folklore link, which is the ethnographic survey. If you go into that and if you type rowan into the search engine, it'll come up with loads of examples of where rowan was used in various folk charms and protection for buildings and people. And that whole story about the changeling being cured by rowan smoke. So, you know, rowan could be used in lots of different ways. You could set fire to it. You can make a rod out of it. You could have rowan above your doorway to keep fairies out, witches out, things like that. So yeah, it was used everywhere.
Steph was asking, I was wondering when you were discussing the similarities between Russian rituals and the similarities between the ones in Dumfries area, how that connection could have come about. Would this have been people who had been travelling from Russia?
I think I don't know if there's any kind of concrete connection between beliefs in Russia and in Galloway, but what you have everywhere within folklore are these recurring types of behavior, which it could be said just emerge from the basic conditions of human existence, which is you want somewhere to live, you believe in spirit, you want to build somewhere, you're worried the spirit might be there. So you have different ways of appeasing those spirits. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's a direct connection with Russian folklore. I know certainly a lot of writers try and make these kind of really broad, sweeping connections that everywhere in Europe there was some sort of shamanic person within a community, and a whole sort of series of shamans originating in parts of Russia and Siberia, and those ideas being tracked across Europe. I don't know of the historical veracity of those theories. I'm not sure. But what I would say is that there definitely is parallels of behavior everywhere. And how we track that down and how we log it anthropologically, or in terms of, you know, race and so on and so forth, is really complicated. And I certainly won't, you know, be able to make any definitive statement about that. But that's what's interesting about folklore. I think it's kind of so evocative, and the connections are near there, but not quite falling into place. And that's why folklore has often been relegated to outside of the academic world. You know, it's not always seen as a legitimate study. It's just sort of weird, erroneous stuff that happened in the past. You know, and actually, what's happening, and certainly in the context of material culture is helping us to reinterrogate this material and think about it in new ways. So that's not really answered the question about Russian connection, but you know what I mean? It's difficult to answer those questions. It's really, really hard.
Folklore seems to me to resonate with the human condition across the world and across the centuries. But yes, I can quite see that pinning it down maybe historically has seemed difficult, but the work that you're doing and the intersection with the material culture, absolutely fascinating. Just to say thanks to Peter, thanks to Claire for her support, Rathmel Archaeology, are delivering the Can You Dig It for us. And thanks to our funders, National Lottery, Heritage Fund and Historic Environment Scotland.